In the Voss Financial Tower on the 42nd floor of downtown Manhattan, nobody noticed Wren. Wait, not that Wren. Different person entirely. Nobody noticed Bette Sorel. That was perhaps the most useful thing about her. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and built the way women in her family had always been built. Soft in the middle, round in the face, with hands that were quick and competent and never once described as elegant. She wore the same rotation of dark blazers every week because dark blazers didn't wrinkle on the subway and didn't show the coffee she inevitably spilled during the 7:42 Express. She kept her brown hair twisted back in a clip she'd bought at a Duane Reade 3 years ago and never replaced. She arrived at Aldgate Capital Management every morning at 7:45 minutes before anyone else, which was rarely before 8. She was the senior forensic analyst on the risk assessment team. Most people at Aldgate didn't know her that. Most people at Aldgate didn't know her name. To them, she was the woman who sat in the glass-walled office on the 42nd floor and turned incomprehensible numbers into reports that somehow always saved the firm from disasters nobody else had seen coming. She was the one who'd flagged the Meridian exposure 6 weeks before it collapsed. She was the one who'd caught the ghost accounts in the Stellarex acquisition when 3 separate due diligence teams had missed them. She was furniture, useful, reliable, invisible furniture. To Cord Ashmore, she was the absolute backbone of his firm's survival. He just hadn't said so out loud yet. Cord Ashmore was not a man who said things out loud that he didn't have to. He was 40 years old, 6'2", and had the kind of controlled stillness that people in his world mistook for calm. It wasn't calm, it was containment. He'd built Aldgate Capital from a 2-person operation running out of a sublet office in Midtown into one of the most quietly feared alternative investment firms on the Eastern Seaboard. Feared not because of aggression, but because of accuracies. Cord didn't lose money, he didn't lose cases, he didn't lose people he'd decided to keep. He had dark eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation in certain circles that had nothing to do with his SEC filings. Aldgate Capital was, on paper, a private equity and risk management firm. Off paper, it was the financial infrastructure for half the power players in the Northeast shadow economy, old money families, political fixers, a handful of organizations whose primary business did not appear in any annual report. Cord hadn't built that world. He'd inherited it from his father and grandfather before him, and he'd spent 20 years becoming indispensable to it in ways that made him untouchable. He knew where everybody was buried. Sometimes, literally. Bette didn't know any of that when she took the job 4 years ago. She'd been hired through a clean recruitment process, vetted 6 ways to Sunday, and told she'd be doing forensic analysis for a high-net-worth investment firm, which was true, entirely true. The parts that weren't in the job description revealed themselves slowly, the way a fog lifts. First, you think it's just a particularly aggressive client. Then you notice the way certain meetings ended and certain people never came back. Then one day, you're analyzing a cash flow structure that you recognize from a federal prosecution case study, and you understand, with a clarity that should have terrified you, exactly what kind of water you're swimming in. Bette had understood, and she had stayed. Not because she was naive, not because she was trapped, because the work was the most intellectually demanding thing she'd ever done in her life, and because she was very, very good at it, and because some part of her, the part that had grown up invisible, overlooked, underestimated at every single turn, found a particular satisfaction in being the one who saw what no one else could see. She noticed everything. Nobody noticed her. That was the arrangement. She'd accepted it. What she hadn't accepted, what she'd never quite managed to make peace with, was the way her chest did something complicated and unwanted every single time Cord Ashmore walked past her office without looking up. The night everything changed started, as most disasters do, with something small. A data irregularity in the Hollis Group transfer, 47 cents off on a 9-figure transaction. The kind of discrepancy that should have been a rounding error, but wasn't. Because Bette didn't believe in coincidences that appeared in wire transfers at 11:58 p.m. on a Friday when the compliance team had already gone home. She'd pulled the full ledger, cross-referenced it against 3 subsidiary accounts, and found it. A systematic siphoning pattern so elegant it was almost beautiful, buried inside 6 months of legitimate transactions. Someone inside Aldgate had been skimming from the Hollis account. Not a lot by the standards of the sums moving through these accounts. Enough to matter to the people the Hollis Group answered to, and those people were not the kind who accepted explanations. She was still at her desk at 11 p.m. when the fire alarm went off. Not a drill. She knew it wasn't a drill, because the building's fire suppression system engaged simultaneously on floors 40 through 44, and because 3 seconds later, every light on the floor cut to emergency red. And because through the glass wall of her office, she could see 2 men she'd never seen before moving through the corridor with the specific, purposeful stillness of people who were not trying to evacuate. Bette had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early to read the difference between a person in a hurry and a person on a mission. She grabbed her laptop, her external drive, and her phone, and was already moving toward the stairwell when a hand closed around her arm. She spun, one elbow up, an instinct her older brother had drilled into her when she was 14, and stopped when she recognized the face. Cord Ashmore was looking at her with an expression she had never once seen on him in 4 years. He looked concerned. "Not that way," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it was in board meetings. Low, controlled, completely uninterested in your objections. "There are men on this floor," she said. "They're not here for a fire. I know." He was already moving, his hand still on her arm, steering her away from the stairwell toward the server corridor that ran behind the main floor. "I need you with me. You need." She nearly stumbled and caught herself. "Why?" He glanced back at her for half a second. In the red emergency light, she couldn't read his face the way she normally could. "Because," he said, "you're the only other person in this building who knows what's on that drive." The server room on 42 was soundproofed and climate-controlled, and had a biometric lock that only 3 people had access to. Cord was one of them. He pulled her inside, and the door sealed behind them with a sound like a bank vault closing, and suddenly, the emergency alarm was just a distant pulse, and they were standing in the cool blue-white glow of 100 server towers. Bette stood with her laptop pressed to her chest and looked at Cord Ashmore and said, "You need to tell me what's happening." He was already at one of the terminals. Someone tipped off the Hollis principals that there's an irregularity in the transfer records. "I found the irregularity tonight. I haven't told anyone." Someone else found it first. He typed something fast, and a display populated with transaction logs she recognized, and decided the cleanest solution was to remove the records and the analyst. The server room suddenly felt much smaller. "They're here for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "They're here for the data." He glanced at her. "You're collateral. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be." He held out his hand, the external drive. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. 4 years of being invisible to this man, of producing work that kept his firm standing while he moved through her floor without a glance, and now he was standing in a server room at 11 p.m., asking her to hand over the most dangerous piece of evidence she'd ever compiled. "Tell me something first," she said. He waited. That was the thing about Cord. He didn't push. He stilled, and waited, and let the silence do the work. "Did you know?" she asked. "About the Hollis account, did you know there was a leak?" Something moved across his face. Not guilt, something older and more complicated than guilt. "I suspected," he said, 3 weeks ago. "I started an internal audit, and you didn't tell me. I didn't want to expose you to the risk before I had to." 4 years of invisible. 4 years of furniture, and apparently, in those same 4 years, he'd been making decisions about her exposure to risk. "You've been watching out for me," she said slowly, "without telling me." He didn't answer, which was, she had learned in 4 years, Cord Ashmore's version of yes. She handed him the drive. They were in that server room for 4 hours. She didn't know it then. Didn't know what those 4 hours would cost her, what they would rearrange, what would become impossible to walk back after. She thought it was just a crisis, the way all the other crises had been crises. Contained, managed, resolved. She thought she would go home, sleep for 3 hours, and come back Monday morning and the world would have reset. It didn't reset. The men in the corridor cleared out by 2 a.m. Cord made 2 calls, both brief, both in a voice she'd never heard him use, and whatever he said to whoever was on the other end of those calls moved things she didn't have vocabulary for. By 3 a.m. he had the identities of the internal actor, the chain of contacts, and the likely next move of the Hollis principals. By 4 a.m. the crisis, functionally, was over, and they were still in the server room, sitting on the floor with their backs against the cool metal cabinet of a server tower, because neither of them had moved and neither of them had said anything about moving, and at some point the distance between them had simply gotten smaller without either of them deciding to close it. "You've been here 4 years," Cord said. It was the first thing either of them had said in 40 minutes. "Yes," Bette said. "You found the Meridian exposure, yes, and Stellarex accounts." He was quiet for a moment. "I read every report you've ever filed." She turned her head and looked at him. In the blue server room light, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and his hair not quite as controlled as it was at 9 a.m., he looked like someone she didn't entirely know. "You never came to debrief me," she said. "You always sent Hargrove. Hargrove is easier to read. I knew what he'd say." He looked at the server towers across from them. "If I came in myself, I wouldn't know what I'd say." The thing in Bette's chest did the complicated unwanted thing again, except this time it was worse because this time she understood what it was. "Cord," she said. "Don't," he said. "I haven't said anything yet. You were going to say something sensible." He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the one from the corridor, that concerned, uncontrolled thing that didn't belong on him. "I've spent 4 years being sensible about this." Bette Sorel, who had spent 31 years being overlooked, who had spent 4 years being invisible, who had spent her entire adult life being the smartest persons in rooms that never bothered to look at her, said nothing, and the distance closed entirely. She didn't mean for it to happen. That wasn't quite true. She'd meant it in the server room, when it was just the 2 of them and the crisis and 4 years of unsaid things finally taking up too much space. What she hadn't meant was the morning after. And the morning after that, and the discovery 6 weeks later, that changed everything. She took the test in the single-occupancy bathroom on the 38th floor at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, before anyone else was in the building. She'd bought 4 of them, different brands, because she was an analyst and Analyst verified, and she stood in that small room with the window that looked out over the steel-colored Hudson and watched all 4 of them give her the same answer, and felt the floor shift underneath her. She was methodical, even then. Even in the shock of it, she sat on the edge of the bathroom sink and made herself think through it clearly, the way she thought through every problem. What are the variables? What are the constraints? What is the most likely outcome of each available path? One path led back through that door and upstairs and into Cord Ashmore's office. The other path led home, then to a different city, then to a new job, a different name on her work email, a distance that might be enough. She chose the second path. She had her resignation drafted by 9 a.m. She submitted it to HR at 9:15 and was at her desk packing her personal items into a box by 9:30. She didn't take much. The Dwayne Reade hair clip, a small succulent she'd carried through 3 job changes, her brother's photo. She was in the elevator at 9:47 when the doors opened on 42, and Cord was standing there. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Excuse me?" "No." He held the elevator doors open with one hand and looked at her with that still, contained expression and said, "You're not doing this. I resigned, officially. HR works for me." His voice hadn't changed. It was still the board meeting voice, the 2 a.m. phone call voice. "Come back upstairs, Cord." She shifted the box against her hip. She was not going to do this in an elevator. She was not going to let him look at her like that in an elevator with her succulent and her brother's photo and the absolute knowledge of what she was carrying. "I've made my decision." "Based on what?" She didn't answer. He studied her, not the way he studied reports, not the fast, efficient scan of a man looking for data. Something slower, something that felt uncomfortably like the way people looked when they were trying to read someone they genuinely couldn't decode. "Bette," he said. "Just her name. Nothing else." She'd heard him say her name exactly twice in 4 years. Once when she'd been introduced to him, and once in the server room, in the dark, when it hadn't sounded like a name so much as something he'd been holding for a long time. This was the 3rd time. "Come upstairs," said. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to. You're not invisible to me." His voice didn't change pitch, but something shifted in it, some layer she'd never heard before. "You never were, not for a single day of those 4 years. I need you to know that before you walk out of this building." The elevator doors tried to close. He stopped them again without looking away from her. Bette Sorel stood in that elevator with a box of her things, and 4 positive pregnancy tests, and 4 years of believing she was furniture, and she felt something crack open in the middle of her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "I'm pregnant," she said. The words were out before she decided to say them. The analyst's approach: "Give him the data. See what he does with it." Cord Ashmore went very still. Not his normal still, a different kind, the kind of stillness that happened when a person was receiving information of genuine consequence, processing it at the speed of someone who didn't make errors. "Come upstairs," he said again. His voice was exactly the same. But his eyes weren't. She went upstairs. She told herself it was because she still had unfinished work on the Hollis documentation, and she was a professional, and she didn't leave things unfinished. This was not entirely true. She went upstairs because he'd said, "You're not invisible to me," and she was not strong enough, in that particular moment, to walk away from that. His office was on the 44th floor, corner, north-facing, with a view of the park that she'd stood in exactly once when he'd called her up to review the Meridian documentation in person. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't pour her water. He stood at his window with his back to her for a long moment, and then he turned around. "Tell me what you need," he said. Of all the things she'd anticipated him saying, that wasn't one of them. "What? Tell me what you need. Space, time, arrangements. Tell me what you need and I'll make it happen." Bette set the box down on the chair next to her and looked at him carefully. "That's not how does this work then? You don't get to just manage this like a risk assessment. I'm not managing it like a risk assessment." Something shifted in his face, a fracture in the control. "I'm managing it badly because the only appropriate response to this is something I'm not good at, and I'm trying to be useful instead." She had not expected that. She had not expected the fracture, or the admission, or the slight roughness at the edge of his voice when he said it. "What's the appropriate response?" she asked. "Telling you that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you for 4 years, he said. "That every time I sent Hargrove to debrief you, I told myself it was professional discretion, and it wasn't. It was because I didn't trust myself to sit across from you and pretend the way I'd been pretending." The room was very quiet. "Telling you that," he said, "and then asking you not to leave." Bette sat down, not in the chair with her box on it, on the other one, across from his desk. She sat down because her legs had made a unilateral decision. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "Neither do I." He sat too, finally, across from her. "I've been running worst-case scenarios in my head since the elevator. They're not good. You've been running scenarios for 11 minutes. I'm fast." She almost laughed. The almost was more undoing than an actual laugh would have been. "I'm not going to disappear," she said. She heard herself say it and understood it was a decision she was making in real time. "But I'm not going to pretend this is simple. I'm not asking you to. It's going to be complicated, what you do, what this firm is, what that would mean for." She stopped for a child. He didn't flinch. She'd expected him to flinch. "I know," he said. I've been restructuring certain operations for the past 18 months, moving things toward legitimate capital. It's slow. It's not finished." He met her eyes. "But it's not theoretical. I've been doing it before this. I'd have done it anyway." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm 40 years old," he said. "And I've spent those 40 years being indispensable to a world I'm not sure I want to be indispensable to anymore." Bette looked at him. Cord Ashmore, who sat across from senators at charity dinners, and across from men who moved money like water, and across from her, now, with something honest and uncomfortable on his face. "That's not enough," she said. "That's not enough to build anything on. I know. I'm not going to be managed. I'm not going to be kept somewhere safe and consulted when convenient if we're doing this." She heard herself again, making another decision. "I'm not an asset. I'm not a liability. I'm a person. I know that," he said. And then, more quietly, "I have always known that." The crack in her chest from the elevator opened a little wider. "Then say it to me like you mean it," she said. "Not in this office. Not because we're in a situation. Say it when there's no crisis, no leverage, no reason to." He held her gaze. "Ask me again in 6 months. It's not a promise," he agreed. "It's a commitment. There's a difference. 6 months was a long time to learn a person. It was also, as it turned out, not enough time and exactly enough time simultaneously. She stayed. Not at Aldgate. She renegotiated her role, independent consulting, a structure that gave her the work she loved without the entanglements that would compromise her if the restructuring Cord had described didn't materialize. He hadn't objected. He'd had the paperwork drawn up the next morning. She watched him work, not the performance of it, not the board meeting composure or the 2am phone call voice, but the actual architecture of it, the decisions he made and why, the things he was dismantling and what he was building in their place. She was, after all, a forensic analyst. She knew how to read the evidence of a pattern over time. The pattern was real. Slow and methodical and genuinely unglamorous, the way actual change always was, but real. Her brother Theo drove up from Philadelphia 3 times to have increasingly alarming conversations with Cord, that Cord handled with more equanimity than Bette's brother had been prepared for. Her mother called every Sunday and asked careful, pointed questions that Bette answered as honestly as she could, which was more honestly than she'd answered her mother about anything in years. She was 7 months along when she finally moved into the West Village brownstone. She'd resisted it longer than was practical. She knew she'd resisted it, and she knew why, because accepting it would mean she'd stopped doing the thing she'd done her whole life, which was managing her own exposure, keeping her own counsel, being sufficient to herself in all the ways that no one had ever suggested she needed to be otherwise. The night she moved in, Cord sat across from her at the kitchen table while she worked through a consulting report. And he read something, and occasionally one of them said a thing, and the other one said something back. And there was none of the performance or the drama or the crisis mode intensity of every significant conversation they'd had before. It was just the table, and the work, and him. She looked up from her laptop. "You said ask you again in 6 months," she said. He set down what he was reading. "You're not invisible," he said. "You were never invisible. You were the first person I saw when I walked onto that floor, and you were the last thing I thought about when I left it. And I spent 4 years making it very difficult for myself, because I didn't know how to have this without risking something I couldn't afford to lose." He met her eyes. "I know that's not a clean answer. I don't need a clean answer," Bette said. "I'm an analyst. I work with messy data." Something moved across his face that she recognized, finally, after all this time, as the particular expression Cord Ashmore made when he was genuinely happy, and didn't know what to do with it. "We're going to be fine," he said, not a reassurance. A read of the data, delivered in the same voice he used when he was certain. Bette Sorel, who had spent 31 years being invisible and underestimated and written off by every room she'd ever walked into, looked at the evidence of the past 6 months, cross-referenced it against everything she knew about this man, and reached her own conclusion. "Yeah," she said, "I think we are. The night their daughter was born, the waiting room of Lenox Hill Hospital contained, among others, Bette's mother, who cried from the moment she arrived and didn't stop. Theo, who paced a circuit around the room so many times a nurse, eventually asked him if he was all right, and two men in dark coats who stood near the elevator and whose presence Bette's mother found puzzling and Theo found alarming, and who were, in fact, there because Cord had made a call 6 months ago, and certain people had agreed that Aldgate's transition was progressing in good faith and certain old debts were being cleared. Nobody bothered them. The next morning, Cord stood at the window of the hospital room while Bette held their daughter, and the November light came in grey and flat off the East River, and he turned around and looked at them both with an expression that he didn't bother containing. He'd sent a message to his full board at 6 a.m. It read, "Effective immediately. I am stepping back from all non-legitimate operations. If you have questions, contact legal. I don't anticipate questions." He hadn't told Bette he was going to do it. She found out when her phone showed her a forwarded message from a contact she trusted, and she read it twice and looked up at him. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I wanted you to see it happen," he said, "not hear about it." She looked down at their daughter, who was 8 hours old and already apparently unimpressed by the world, based on her expression. "She's going to be terrifying," Bette said. "She's going to be exactly like her mother," Cord said. "So yes." Bette laughed. Really laughed, the full version, undone and unguarded, the kind she'd been doing more of in the past 6 months than in the previous decade combined. The two men in the dark coats left the hospital around noon. They didn't say goodbye, they didn't need to. The room was quiet after that. Theo brought terrible coffee from the vending machine, and Bette's mother fussed with the blanket, and Cord sat on the edge of the bed and held his daughter for the first time, with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. Bette watched him. She had spent her 4 years being invisible. She had spent her whole life being the person in the room who noticed everything that no one noticed about her. She was done with that particular arrangement. "Look up," she said. Cord looked up. "You see me," she said. "Yes," he said. "Say it out loud, for the record." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the servers on the night they'd sat on the floor together, like she was the most important data point in the room, and he'd stopped pretending otherwise. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever been trusted to know," he said. "I see you, Bette. Every single part of you. I have not stopped seeing you since the first day." The room was very quiet. Then their daughter made a small decisive sound that suggested she had opinions about being used as a prop in other people's emotional moments. And Bette's mother laughed, and Theo spilled his terrible coffee, and the moment broke into something warmer and louder and entirely ordinary, which was, Bette thought, exactly right. She had spent enough of her life waiting to be seen by rooms that weren't worth her attention. This room, this small, bright, noisy, ordinary room, was worth every single second.